All right, folks, I want to talk a bit about indictments. Indictments are things you hear about in the press all the time. Trump was indicted and this person was indicted. When is he being arraigned on his indictment, and so on and so forth. Indictments are, you know, one of those things that you hear about in the press all the time, and many people don't know what it means. So let's talk about what an indictment is. So in very serious cases, right, in many cases, in many states, in many jurisdictions, you have a division between a misdemeanor and a felony, right? A low-level offense for which there is relatively low jail time, up to a year perhaps, and a serious offense that can land you in jail for a whole long period of time. And for the serious offenses, right, the murders, the rapes, the arsons, right, the very serious crimes, the serious charges, our system puts in place an extra layer of protection for those folks, right? Because the penalties are so possibly severe in those cases. The system says, well, because the penalties are so severe, we need more protection. We need to ensure that the process is extra fair when it comes to these people. And so we've instituted this indictment process, right? An indictment takes place when a grand jury is impaneled, right? A grand jury is different than a trial jury, right? It's not what you see on TV. A grand jury is a collection of people, 16 to 23, but it can depend, that get together and vote as to whether or not there is enough evidence to take a person to trial, right? Again, very different than a trial jury. Now, when does an indictment typically take place? Typically, it'll happen after the arrest. After somebody is arrested, there is a period of time, generally speaking, that allows the prosecutor period to gather witnesses and evidence and to present the case to a grand jury in an effort to have that grand jury return an indictment, return what's called a true bill. Now, sometimes these things happen after, or rather before an arrest, but that's rare. Typically, indictments and grand juries are impaneled after arrests. And the big question is, do indictments really matter, right? Because they sound like they matter and they sound like they're a big deal, but are they? Well, the answer is really yes and no, right? Look, nobody ever wants to be indicted. Okay, an indictment isn't something that one prefers or one strives for. No person or criminal defendant, for that matter, seeks an indictment. Trust me. And the grand jury process isn't a fun process to go through. But in most cases, indictments are really far gone conclusions. Depending on where you are in the country, there is well over a 90% chance of an indictment, well over 95%, close to 100%, really, depending on where you are. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Number one, the grand jury process is secret, right? You'll never see it on TV. You'll never see any member of the public be allowed in. It's a secret process. It's very different than a trial. It's very different than most other court processes, right? You will never be able to walk in to a grand jury proceeding, right? As you would to a trial, for example. Now, in a grand jury, only prosecutors can present evidence, not defense lawyers, right? Defense lawyers cannot put on a case as they would be able to, for example, during a trial. Defense lawyers can't cross-examine witnesses. They can't present evidence. Judges, if they are present during the presentation to the grand jury, typically don't do anything of any substance or say anything, right? And the defendant can't really object to what's going on in the grand jury process, right? So what a defendant can do and the ways that the defendant can defend himself or herself in the grand jury, right? Those ways are extremely limited. And that's why the indictment is so easy to come by. That's why most defense lawyers don't care, so to speak, about indictments, because they know they're coming. Right now, look, the defendant does have a right to testify before the grand jury. You typically don't want to do that for a variety of reasons, right? One of which is you may bind yourself to a story, right? You don't know what'll happen down the line. You don't know what'll happen at a trial. You don't know what theories of defense your lawyer will have to explore, right? So most lawyers do not recommend that their clients testify before the grand jury. Again, the indictment is such a foregone conclusion that unless you have a really strong defense, and that happens almost never, at least as it relates to the way the system is structured, you never put your client into the grand jury. You always have the right. You almost never do it. Now, the standard before a grand jury. That's important, right? What standard does the grand jury have to meet to return an indictment? Or rather, what standard does the prosecutor have to meet? Is it reasonable doubt? Is it preponderance of the evidence? It's very low. The standard is effectively probable cause, right? Probable cause is a very low standard that basically means a fair probability of criminal activity. So the prosecutor in a grand jury can present evidence, not have the defense challenge it effectively, and benefit from that very low probable cause standard. That is why indictments generally by defense lawyers are not taken seriously. Now, should indictments be ignored? Of course not. They're part of the process. They should be paid attention to. And look, on some level, they're important, right? Number one, if you're a defense lawyer, you may get a glimpse into the prosecution's evidence, right? That's a big deal. You may get a glimpse of where they're going with their case, right? What they're going to present at a trial. Beyond that, witnesses testify for the grand jury, right? And if that happens down the line, you may get a transcript of that testimony to use at trial, right? And that is where the money is made if you're a defense lawyer, right? Impeaching witnesses, looking at prior inconsistent statements, looking at prior inconsistent testimony, incredible testimony, as they call it, right? So certainly indictments and grand jury processes shouldn't be ignored. But the standard is so low that most defense lawyers basically know their client will be indicted should a prosecutor choose to present a case to the grand jury. Now, oftentimes, prosecutors have deadlines within which they must present a case to a grand jury. And that's a big deal as well, right? Because it holds the prosecutor to a standard. It holds the prosecutor to a time limit, a deadline, right? You want that. You want prosecutors to push cases so that defendants don't sit and wait for trials, oftentimes in prison for months, sometimes even years. You hear very severe cases around the country, depending on where you are, right? So the indictment process, the grand jury process, these things are important, right? And they're primarily important if you think about a criminal case in the context of a trial, right? That is the holy grail of a criminal case. And this process will provide some evidence, some insight as to the prosecutor's case, as to what will happen in the grand jury, rather in the trial, right? What witnesses will be put on? What may those witnesses testify to? So it's important to keep in mind that indictments in and of themselves don't mean terribly much, but in the context of the process should certainly not be ignored and should certainly be paid attention to.